You know, there is something rather curious about guilt. We treat it as though it were the voice of God, as though it were the final authority on right and wrong, as though the mere presence of guilt proves that we have done something terrible. Someone says, "I feel guilty about leaving," and we all nod gravely as if guilt were evidence, as if the feeling itself were proof of wrongdoing. But what if I told you that the guilt you feel about leaving is not your conscience at all? What if that heavy, suffocating feeling that keeps you awake at night, that whispers you are selfish, you are cruel, how could you do this to them? What if that voice does not belong to you? What if it was planted there, carefully, deliberately, over years and years, by the very person you are trying to leave? Because you see, guilt is the most elegant chain ever devised. You do not need walls to imprison someone. You do not need locks or bars or guards. All you need is to make them believe that leaving is a sin. And once that belief is installed, once it is woven into the very fabric of how they see themselves, they will imprison themselves. They will stay. Not because they want to, not because the situation is good for them, but because they cannot bear the weight of what they have been taught to feel when they consider walking away. Now, before we go any further, let me be very clear about something. I am not talking about the natural, healthy guilt that arises when you have genuinely wronged someone. If you have betrayed a trust, if you have been deliberately cruel, if you have acted without conscience, then yes, guilt is appropriate. That guilt is your moral compass functioning correctly. It is telling you something true about your behavior, and it deserves your attention. But that is not the kind of guilt we are discussing today. The guilt I want to talk about is something else entirely. It is the guilt that arises when you have done nothing wrong except finally choosing yourself. It is the guilt that floods you when you dare to say, "This is not working for me." It is the guilt that makes you feel like a criminal for the simple act of protecting your own life. And this guilt, this manufactured, installed, weaponized guilt, this is not your conscience speaking. This is their control, still operating inside your mind, long after you have physically walked away. Let me tell you how this works. Because once you understand the mechanism, the spell begins to break. And I want to show you 5 ways this false guilt operates so you can recognize it for what it truly is. The first way is through the inversion of responsibility. This is perhaps the most fundamental trick. The person who harmed you has somehow convinced you that you are the one causing harm. Think about the absurdity of this for a moment. You endured years of manipulation, of emotional neglect, of having your reality questioned and your needs dismissed. You survived conditions that would have broken many people. And now, when you finally summon the courage to leave, you feel guilty. You, the one who was harmed, feel guilty for no longer accepting the harm. How did this happen? It happened because the manipulator spent years teaching you a very particular lesson. The lesson was this: their feelings matter more than yours. Their comfort is more important than your survival. Their version of reality is the only valid one. And your job, your entire purpose, is to maintain their emotional equilibrium, regardless of the cost to yourself. When you internalize this lesson deeply enough, leaving feels like violence. Not violence against them, though that is how they will frame it, but violence against the very structure of reality as you have been taught to understand it. You have been programmed to believe that your existence is justified only through service to them. And so when you stop serving, when you reclaim yourself, the program screams at you. It says you are wrong, you are bad, you are destroying everything. But the program is not your conscience. The program is their voice, still running inside your head. I once knew a woman, 68 years old, who had spent 40 years in a marriage where she was never quite enough. Her cooking was never right. Her opinions were never valued. Her feelings were always too much, or too little, or at the wrong time entirely. And when she finally left, when her children were grown and she had no more excuses to stay, do you know what she felt? Not relief, not freedom, guilt, crushing, unbearable guilt. She told me she felt as though she had committed murder, as though by choosing to live her remaining years in peace, she had done something unforgivable. And I looked at her and I said, "Whose voice is that? Whose voice tells you that choosing yourself is a crime?" And she was quiet for a very long time. And then she said, "It is his voice. It has always been his voice. I just thought it was mine." The second way false guilt operates is through the weaponization of loyalty. We have this notion, deeply embedded in our culture, that loyalty means staying, that commitment means enduring, that love means never leaving, no matter what. And these are beautiful ideas in theory, but they have been twisted, perverted, turned into instruments of imprisonment by people who understand how to exploit them. The manipulator knows that you are a person of integrity. They know you value loyalty. They know you take your commitments seriously, and so they use these very qualities against you. They frame the relationship in terms of duty and obligation rather than mutual care. They remind you of what you promised. They invoke the sacred nature of the bond. They say, "After everything I have done for you, after all these years, after all we have been through, you would just leave?" And you hear this, and your gut twists, because they are speaking to the part of you that genuinely does value loyalty. But here is what they have deliberately obscured. Loyalty is not a suicide pact. Commitment does not mean commitment to your own destruction. And love, real love, never requires you to annihilate yourself to prove it exists. The person who truly loves you would never want you to stay in a situation that is killing you. The person who truly cares about your well-being would say, "Go, save yourself, even if it hurts me." But the manipulator does not say this because they do not love you. They need you. And there is a vast, vast difference between being loved and being needed. Love liberates. Need imprisons. Love says, "I want you to be happy, even if that happiness is not with me." Need says, "You cannot leave, because what will I do without you?" And when they invoke loyalty, when they remind you of your promises, when they make you feel that leaving is betrayal, they are not speaking from love. They are speaking from need, from control, from the desperate terror of losing their supply of attention and service and emotional regulation. The third way is through the corruption of your empathy. And this one is particularly cruel because it targets your greatest strength. You see, most people who end up in these situations are not weak. They are, in fact, extraordinarily strong. They have survived what would have broken others. But they also possess something that the manipulator recognized early on and learned to exploit. They have the capacity to feel deeply. They can sense another person's pain. They can imagine what it is like to be in someone else's position. They care genuinely and profoundly about the well-being of others. And this capacity for empathy, this beautiful human quality, has been turned into a weapon against them. The manipulator learned that all they had to do was show pain, real or performed, and you would abandon your own needs to attend to theirs. They learned that your empathy was a lever that could be pulled at any time to redirect your attention away from yourself and back to them. And so when you try to leave, they do not rage. Or perhaps they do rage, but when the rage does not work, they switch to something far more effective. They crumble. They weep. They show you their vulnerability, their fear, their desperate need. And your empathy, that magnificent, terrible gift, it responds. It says, look at them, they are suffering. Look at what you are doing to them. How can you cause this pain? But here is what your empathy does not tell you. Because empathy alone does not come with discernment. It does not tell you that their suffering is not your responsibility. It does not tell you that their pain existed long before you and will continue long after you leave. It does not tell you that by staying to manage their emotions, you are not helping them. You are enabling them. You are preventing them from ever having to face themselves. Your empathy sees the wound, but it does not ask who made the wound. It does not ask whether the wound is even real or merely displayed for your benefit. And so you stay, not because staying is right, but because your own capacity for feeling has been hijacked. The fourth way is through the erosion of your right to choose. Over time, the manipulator has subtly but thoroughly dismantled your belief that you have the right to make decisions about your own life. They have done this through 1,000 small moments. Every time you expressed the preference and they dismissed it. Every time you stated a boundary and they crossed it. Every time you said, "This is what I need," and they told you that you were being ridiculous or selfish or ungrateful. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, you began to doubt yourself. You began to believe that your perceptions were unreliable, that your needs were excessive, that your desire for something different, something better, something that did not hurt, was itself evidence of your own selfishness. And now when you consider leaving, this erosion manifests as guilt, because you no longer fully believe you have the right to leave. Some part of you still wonders, who am I to want more? Who am I to say this is not enough? Who am I to put myself first? And this questioning, this fundamental uncertainty about your own right to choose your own life, this is not humility. This is damage. This is what happens when someone has spent years systematically teaching you that you do not matter, that your voice does not count, that your experience of reality is not valid. The fifth way is through the manipulation of your identity. This is the deepest cut of all. The manipulator has not merely controlled your behavior, they have shaped your sense of self. They have taught you that being a good person means enduring, that being a loving person means sacrificing, that being a worthy person means putting others first, always, without exception. And so your very identity, who you believe yourself to be, is now wired to the relationship. Leaving does not just mean leaving a person. It means leaving behind the version of yourself that you have constructed over years, the version that believes goodness equals suffering, that love equals pain, that your worth is measured by how much you can endure without complaint. When you leave, this identity feels like it is dying, and in a sense, it is. The self that was built to serve the manipulator, the self that defined its worth through sacrifice, that self cannot survive the departure. And so it screams. It screams through guilt. It says, you are destroying who you are. You are betraying everything you stand for. You are becoming someone unrecognizable. But here is the truth that the guilt will never tell you. The self that is dying was never truly yours. It was a construction, a prison built from the inside out. Carefully engineered identity, designed to keep you exactly where you were. And the person emerging on the other side of this guilt, the one who is terrified and uncertain and cannot quite believe what they are doing, that person is closer to who you actually are than the dutiful, suffering, endlessly sacrificing version ever was. So what do we do with all of this? How do we separate the real voice of conscience from the manufactured voice of control? How do we learn to trust ourselves when trusting ourselves has been systematically discouraged for years, perhaps decades? First, you must understand that guilt, which serves another person's control, always has a particular quality to it. It is absolute. It allows no nuance. It says you are entirely wrong and they are entirely blameless. Real conscience is more complex than this. Real conscience allows for the recognition that a situation is painful for everyone involved, that leaving is hard and sad, but that it is also necessary. Real conscience does not demand that you destroy yourself to avoid causing discomfort to another. If your guilt tells you that you must stay regardless of the cost, that is not conscience, that is programming. Second, you must begin to listen for your own voice beneath the noise. It is still there. It has been there all along, buried under years of conditioning, under the constant barrage of someone else's reality. You can find it in the quiet moments, in the early morning before the world demands anything of you, in the spaces between thoughts, where something older and wiser than guilt still speaks. And what does it say? It says, you deserve peace. It says, your life belongs to you. It says that choosing yourself is not cruelty, it is sanity. Third, you must accept that some people will not understand. They will call you selfish. They will say you gave up too easily. They will shake their heads and tell you that you should have tried harder, stayed longer, sacrificed more. And you must let them have their opinions without allowing those opinions to become your truth. Because the people who tell you to stay are almost never the ones who have to live your life. They are watching from the outside, judging a situation they have never been inside. Their opinion, however well-meaning, is not your conscience either. And here is what nobody tells you about the other side of this guilt. It fades, not all at once, not overnight, but gradually, like fog lifting as the sun rises. There will be mornings when you wake up and the guilt is still there, heavy on your chest, whispering its old accusations. And there will be mornings when you wake up and realize you slept through the night without thinking of them at all. And the space between those mornings grows wider and wider until one day you realize something extraordinary. You are not guilty. You were never guilty. You were brave. You did the hardest thing a person can do. You chose yourself when everything inside you had been trained to choose them. You walked away from the only reality you knew. Because somewhere, deep beneath all the conditioning and the fear and the manufactured shame, you heard a voice, your voice, saying enough, saying no more, saying, I deserve to live. So if you are sitting there right now, carrying this weight, this terrible guilt that makes you question whether you did the right thing, let me tell you something. You did not abandon them. You rescued yourself. You did not fail the relationship. You survived it. You are not selfish for wanting to live without pain. You are human, and the guilt you feel, that relentless, exhausting, suffocating guilt, it is not your conscience. It is the last chain, the final link that still connects you to a prison you have already left. And chains, even invisible ones, can be broken. Not with force, not with anger, but simply by seeing them for what they are. The moment you recognize that the guilt is not yours, that it was installed by someone who needed you to stay small, the moment you truly see this, something shifts. The chain does not fall away all at once, but it loosens. And with each day of choosing yourself, with each morning of waking up free, with each moment of recognizing that your life belongs to you, it loosens a little more. Until one day, you stand in the quiet of your own home, in the peace of your own company, in the vast open space of your own reclaimed life, and you realize the guilt is gone. Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally understood that caring for yourself was never the crown they made it out to be. It was always the answer.